Good evening. Buenas tardes. Welcome to Union Theological Seminary. My name is Samuel Cruz, Associate Professor of Religion and Society. And thank you for coming to this event on Guantanamo Bay. I just want to say that it's interesting. Guantanamo Bay is a place where the human rights of many prisoners are being violated, but we have forgotten about that place here in this country. It doesn't come to our consciousness. And people don't even know what Guantanamo Bay is, but it's occupied territory. It's occupied territory that is the territory of the sovereign country of Cuba, but the United States, because of its power, decided to take possession of that piece of land, and they could do it because they have the power to do so. So there's so many pieces to this issue of Guantanamo Bay from the perspective that I look at it, and it's, I think, a very appropriate topic to be discussed at this time in history. But I first want to introduce to you the president of Union Theological Seminary, the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones.
So, speaking of land, I'm going to begin by acknowledging, as we do at every event, the land that we are on right now. Union Theological Seminary acknowledges and honors the land on which this building stands as the homeland and territory of the Lenape people, as well as the habitat and dwelling place of the many beings they have been in relationship with. We give thanks to all the spirits of nature. We pay respect to the Lenape's people, past, present, and future, and express support for the flourishing of indigenous peoples and lifeways within this place and everywhere. So welcome to Union Theological Seminary. It's so good to have you here. I should say at the very beginning, this has been a very intense week in Morningside Heights, as you are all aware. If you see weariness, it is a well-earned weariness because Union has been out in front and responding to all the events swirling around us. At Union, we have a 187-year legacy of leading on issues of justice. And in that tradition, I thank Union's own very beloved faculty member, the Reverend Dr. Sam Cruz, for leading this charge on justice. And he leads on so many fronts, including today's conversation on an incredible travesty of justice right here in our own nation, perpetrated by our very own government at Guantanamo Bay. But before we get to more of that, I want to take a moment to thank the incredible planning committee that worked tirelessly to ensure the success of today's event, led by Reverend Dr. Sam Cruz. I'm asking all of them to please rise now so we can say thank you to you. Yes. One of them was already standing over here. So today's program, Still a Beast at Bay, 30 years of resisting U.S. suspension of universal human rights at Guantanamo Bay, brings to light the fact that since 2002, in the aftermath of September 11th attacks, the United States has maintained Guantanamo Bay as a site of torture and brutality, holding detainees indefinitely and without trials. Prisoners held at Guantanamo have languished within its prison cells for years without due process, while civil rights organizations worldwide have condemned the United States government for the civil rights violation and the inhuman treatment of Guantanamo's detainees. The United States, while claiming to be a beacon of human rights, continues to support gross human rights violations across the world. And it grieves me to say, even in the present moment, as a war wages on Palestine, where thousands, getting close to 40,000, have been killed, murdered, including children. And it is a human-made humanitarian crisis of epic proportions unfolding before our eyes. It is not lost upon any of us tonight that the detainees at Guantanamo Bay are predominantly Muslim. The people being killed in Palestine are overwhelmingly Muslim. And many of the students being arrested next door, down the street at Columbia University are Muslim, Black and brown allies who are supporting their Muslim siblings. It is indeed our obligation to speak to these gross violations of human and civil and academic rights. And so I am deeply grateful for Dr. Cruz for bringing this important conversation to Union, even before the war started, the most recent iteration of the war in Palestine. And I'm deeply grateful to our speakers this evening, Dr. Dawn E. Walicek, Mohamedou Shaili, Reverend Ron Kamara, who are leading the quest for justice on this crucial human rights issue. I am especially thankful to Mohamedou Shaili for being here. Thank you. I am sorry, and I say this sincerely, for whatever our country did to you. And I'm sorry that in advocating for human rights at Guantanamo on behalf of the detainees, that you have had to keep reliving the trauma you experienced over and over again. On behalf of Union Theological Seminary again, I am deeply sorry. And that is not an empty apology. I sincerely hope that our collective actions and our prayers and our work awaken the conscience of those in power to bring about justice, not just for our Muslim siblings, but for all the people who are suffering under the oppression of injustice around the world and here at home. This evening is a prescient moment. It brings us together in ways we could not have anticipated and yet always knew we're connected. So I want to thank you all deeply for being here, for this moment of conversation. It matters. It really, really matters. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Sam.
Before introducing Professor Walicek, I want to say that the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, when he said an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere, is real. And when there's injustices happening in Guantanamo Bay, the foundation to that injustice is what creates the injustice in Rikers Island. And what creates the injustice of the violation of human rights of undocumented immigrants. The United States and many powerful countries are starting to associate human rights with citizens' rights. And it's a way of them getting away with abusing those who are not citizens. That's why George W. Bush created the term enemy combatants. I don't know if you remember during the Iraqi war. It was so that he didn't have to apply human rights procedures on these people. But human rights have nothing to do with citizenship. It has to do with rights that all humans are entitled to. But I want to introduce Don E. Walicek is a professor at the University of Puerto Rico at Rio Piedras, where he holds a joint appointment in the Department of English and graduate program in linguistics. His main academic interests are in the areas of cultural studies, language contact, socio-historical linguistics, and translation theory. He has been a Fulbright Scholar and a Fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, as well as a visiting scholar at New York University, the University of Chicago, and the University of Bamberg, among other institutions. His publications include chapters and articles on linguistic and cultural contact and decolonization, focusing on places such as Anguilla, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Haiti, the Dominican Republic. In addition, he is a published poet. He is co-editor of the book Guantanamo and American Empire, The Humanities Respond, and Sargasso volume, Guantanamo, What's Next? He has completed public humanities projects built on partnerships with the Anguilla Library Service, Casa de la Historia, Guantanamo City, Cuba, and the Center of Inter-American Studies at the University of Graz in Austria. Walicek serves as the editor of the Caribbean Studies Journal, Sargasso, and he is co-founder of the CAMPS Conferences, a series of academic conferences dedicated to the study of the various types of camps that have been constructed at Guantanamo Bay and their relationship to camps elsewhere in the world. So now let's give a round of applause to our guest speaker tonight. I'll introduce our other fellow speaker when he's ready. Okay, go. Interview.
Do you want to do Muhammad now? Maybe right before his video. What do you think? Just let me know. Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at Union Theological Seminary. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about Guantanamo Bay and some of the research that I've completed there and about it over the last 10 to 15 years. I would like to thank Reverend Dr. Samuel Cruz for his role in organizing this event, and Naya Toussaint, who helped me with logistical matters and answered all of my questions, among other things, as well as the planning committee, those of you who stood a few moments ago, and Reverend Juan Carmona for agreeing to be the respondent and for calling me in a very friendly way a few days ago and making me even more excited about being here. And finally, I'd like to thank some of the former detainees that I've developed friendships with over the last few years for sharing their insights and for collaborating with me in projects such as this presentation tonight. After I finish presenting, Mohamedou Ould Slahi will present in the form of a pre-recorded video, and I will introduce him, or someone will introduce him just before that. So he expresses his thanks as well for being invited to join us tonight. I'm interested in various aspects of Guantanamo Bay. It's such a multi-pronged thing and place and set of ideas. I'm interested in its Caribbean context. I'm interested in going from what people know about it who aren't studying it to, a more informed understanding of its history and its importance to the Caribbean and to the United States, and its importance as a global model now for detention and different types of incarceration. And so you'll hear a bit about these things. In some instances, the horrible practices that we see at Guantanamo Bay are not very different from the horrible practices that exist in other sites of incarceration in the mainland United States. In other ways, Guantanamo Bay is distinct, I would say, mainly because the infractions on people's rights are so bold, and they're done in a very overt manner. They're even sometimes almost bragged about, right? They're presented as necessary infractions of basic rights. Guantanamo Bay is also, I believe, somewhat unique for being a generative space. It's been generative for hundreds of years. So multiple types of infractions of basic rights have occurred there long before Muslims were detained there in 2002, long before the United States occupied the space in the Spanish-American War, and I will share a few examples of those with you. It seems like this unique role that this space has a lot to do with its geographic positioning. It's one of the largest bays in the Americas. The trade winds from West Africa and Western Europe led there, continue to lead there. There are powerful ocean currents that helped shape the history of the Caribbean and the Americas, and that had a profound impact. This made the site important in the context of Spanish colonialism, for example, the refuge sought by the indigenous people in the area, and also the Atlantic slave trade. So I'd like to share some preliminary images with you and talk through them, and then I'll shift into reading some comments that I've prepared. So I see Guantanamo Bay as a site of conscience. This, once again takes us back to geography. A site of conscience is a place of memory, and it prevents erasure from taking place, right? Once we acknowledge a place as a site of conscience, the normal processes of erasure, right? The sort of emptying of this place of its significance and the forgetting that takes place typically, that is pushed back against. Sites of conscience can exist in literature and in art, in people's imagination, or they can be real physical places. Guantanamo is all of these things. Here you can, this is simply a map of Cuba, but I believe it's useful to revisit this. Guantanamo is in the southeastern part of the country, where that red arrow is in the right-hand corner. And relatively near Haiti. This is a rural part of Cuba today. And here you can see the bay itself. You have a map on the left that has some straight lines in it that are red. That is an international border. So the international border crosses the bay, as you can see. It splits the bay, the inner bay and the outer bay. And you know, on one side you have Cuba, obviously, and then in the base, which is the part that's occupied by the United States, you have US territory, but it's Cuban land. And that's because the space is rented. There is a perpetual lease that dates back to shortly after the Spanish-American War in 1898, right? That was forced upon Cuba, actually, by the United States. I think of Guantanamo as something like these dolls that I remember from my childhood. Maybe this isn't the perfect metaphor, but I think it kind of pushes us in the right direction because it is many things. And so just to talk about it, sometimes we need to be a bit more specific than we usually are and make sure that the people involved in the dialogue or conversation or debate understand the complexity of the place. So you have Guantanamo is a province of Cuba. It's the easternmost province. It's also a city, the capital of that province, Guantanamo City. It's obviously the base, which is a US naval base, referred to often as Gitmo. And then it's the prison, which is quite infamous. And the main focus of my presentation tonight. But it can also be divided into a camp system. So the US military decided to organize this prison a little differently than others, and it implemented the model of camps. And so that's interesting, and we should think about why and what the genealogy of putting people in camps who are already in a prison, what does this date back to? And what was the military able to achieve and do with camps that it would not have been able to do otherwise? Generally, camps have a dehumanizing impact and also affects how people who are outside the camps tend to see the people who are inside them. There's also a migrant operations center in the base, which is separate from the prison, which is hardly ever mentioned. I'm not going to present details about it tonight, but it's important to know that this is there. Sometimes there are a substantial number of people there, and sometimes there are just a few. And then there are other carceral sites that are sometimes called Guantanamo or modeled directly after Guantanamo by other governments. For example, the government of Australia modeled its offshore detention centers after Guantanamo. It looked at the offshore detention practices in Guantanamo in the 1990s. If you go to the parliamentary debates, when this was being decided, which I've done, they say that this was a huge success for the United States, these offshore detention centers in the 1990s that existed at Guantanamo, and that they wanted to replicate them. I don't think anyone who looks at how those camps operated in the 1990s would consider them a success. Even the people who think that they were justified and that they should have been there. So as I will mention, Haitians and Cubans were detained there in the 1990s. Okay, so I'm going to read a bit and then I'll go back to the images. Guantanamo Bay is a place that foreshadows conditions and ideologies that are poised to unfold elsewhere. Yet it is also a place that appears suspended, floating in an eternal present in which past and future are intimately connected, at times almost indistinguishable, revealing patterns that are loyal to both repetition and adaptable to change, it calls us to reimagine the conventions and actions needed to help us make sense of what is decent, fair, and humane. Gitmo, as the site is often called, is shrouded in layers and layers of obfuscation, impossible bureaucracy, and not knowing. It is perhaps the most important negative space of the 21st century. The naval base symbolizes the confluence of key currents of modernity in a place that is divided and divided again. It is both Cuba and the United States. It is both Mayberry, as it is often characterized, and hell. It is both body and belief. And for some, it is now emblematic of Eastern and Western ideologies that are purportedly incompatible. Since 2002, 779 men, all Muslim, have been held at the U.S. military prison at Guantanamo Bay. The prison's operation has extended over more than 22 years. While the prison's construction was justified with statements about the need to secure the nation and the globe, quickly it became clear that it was designed to ensure that the human rights of the men held there would be violated and reconfigured as something lesser than what they were guaranteed by international law. While many observers have referred to the prison as lawless or a no man's land outside the law, I see it as hyper-legal, meaning it's saturated with law. Its operation is saturated in law and a large number of policies that are highly secretive. So we can't even debate these policies because the powers that be won't tell us what they are, right? Some of these policies are low-level policies, others are at the macro level. The base's existence in Cuba, one of the results of the Spanish-American War of 1898, is strategic and deeply embedded in a long and complex history of U.S. jurisprudence. One of the military officials who in recent years has repeatedly spoken out against the decision to keep the prison open is the man who supervised its construction, the three-star U.S. Navy Major General Michael Leonard. He recalls his deployment to the facility as follows. In early January 2002, I received a deployment order to form a joint task force, get to Cuba, and build the first 100 cells in 96 hours, and to be prepared to receive prisoners of war. That's what we called them in this early moment. The fact that we created a detention facility in 87 hours said a great deal about the young troops I led. But it also drove a series of unfortunate early decisions. Many of those administrative decisions involved the application of both U.S. and international law. I'm not a lawyer, but it's very clear that when the country decides to forego generations of legal precedent and start all over, bad things happen. A bit about the construction of the camps. Leonard also recalls the construction of the first camps and how this was done without access to proper materials. They used scrap metal left over from the camps where Haitian refugees lived. These camps were decommissioned and emptied just 7 years prior. Leonard had overseen the operation of the Haitian camps and those built for Cubans in the mid-1990s. When he told his supervisors that the materials were insufficient, he was instructed not to build cells, but to just make dog cages. For those there, it was clear from the beginning that the failure to apply the Geneva Conventions led to the arrival of many men who should have never been captured. They included elderly, juveniles, and many who seemed to have been sent because they had medical or psychological problems. Numerous men reported that they had not been captured, but purchased for a bounty. often cash. Another distinction is that much of the vocabulary used at the site was new. Leonard recalls, as enemy prisoners of war began to arrive, the language the Joint Task Force told us to use began to change. The arrivals were not POWs or even prisoners, but enemy combatants. The place was not a prison, but a detention center. What in other contexts were basic rights were detainee privileges. The list goes on and on. When Leonard and other lawyers asked the military lawyers what it all meant, they were told pretty much whatever you want it to mean. In this and other instances, human rights were gutted and exchanged for state wrongs. The process of releasing the men who should have not been there to begin with has been slow and tedious. It has extended over 4 presidential administrations. The Bush administration transferred about 540 men out of Guantanamo. Most of these men were returned to their countries of origin. Next, Obama transferred about 200 men to various countries around the world, relying on both repatriation and resettlement. So resettlement means they were sent to another country. Almost always, this was the country they did not select. The Trump administration transferred 1 man, sending him to a prison in Saudi Arabia. The Biden administration has repatriated 5 and freed 1 man who served a sentence. Once these men are released, they receive very little support. Some of them receive no support. They receive no apology, no compensation, no physical therapy, no counseling, no access to medicine. And their identities and their names and their past are highly stigmatized. It's impossible to do basic things for some of them, things like, get a job or reintegrate into society. Lawyer and academic Mark Falkoff, editor of the volume Poems from Guantanamo, reported that the review of military documents in 2004 showed only 5% of the hundreds of prisoners at Guantanamo were apprehended on the battlefield, and only 8% have even been accused of having links to Al-Qaeda. The percentage charged and convicted is even smaller. The current prison population. Today, 30 men remain imprisoned at the base. 11 have been charged with war crimes in the military commissions system. This includes 10 men who are awaiting trial and 1 man who has been convicted. 3 other men are held in indefinite law of war detention, where they face tribunal charges, where they do not face tribunal charges, nor are they recommended for release. So once again, there are 3 men who are not facing charges, they haven't been charged with anything, and they're not recommended for release. These 3 are sometimes called forever prisoners. They are described as simultaneously too guilty to be innocent and too dangerous to be released. The remaining 16 men, more than half of the current population, have been cleared for release. Each of these 16 approved for release by multiple U.S. government agencies, I believe there are 5 agencies, are simply waiting. The processes that guide their futures are structured in a way that does not obligate the military to release them. Instead, ongoing detention for these men is the norm. Critics, including former Guantanamo prisoners who advocate on their behalf, insist that President Biden should prioritize their release, but political dynamics suggest that his administration is unlikely to take action, especially during an election year. Most of the men who are caught in this limbo have been waiting for between 2 to 4 years since they were declared eligible for release. But 3 of these men were approved for release more than 14 years ago. We rarely mention their names. I'm going to mention the names of these 3 men who were approved for release 14 years ago. Rida al-Jasiri, Mu'in Abd al-Sattar, and Tawfiq al-Bihani. What is it like to be incarcerated even after you were told you should be released, that you should be free? Former prisoners with whom I have spoken recall that the period of waiting behind bars after being approved for release was the most difficult part of their incarceration. They speak of emotional desperation. One stated that it was harder than the physical torture that he endured. They recalled feeling hopeful that they were moving forward in unjust military tribunals, then a sort of feeling of victory associated with freedom, only to feel that they mattered to no one in the end. Once they are approved for release but continue to be held, there are no more steps for them to go through, nothing to expect. There is no statute to appeal to, no bureaucratic order for them or their lawyers to reach towards. Violence undergirds the nature of the legal proceedings that can determine the futures of the current prisoners. This is an outcome of the US government's efforts to defend not justice, but civilization writ large through a new type of war. This is the type of war that President George W. Bush described as, I quote, "the fight of all who believe in progress and pluralism, tolerance, and freedom," end quote. This was a war that was supposed to make the civilized world proud and defend American values. The chances of the fight, which was initially called Operation Infinite Justice, emerging as just or capable of inspiring peace, never were good. But they were diminished greatly by the decision to use Guantanamo Bay as a site for incarcerating and trying Muslims who were described to the world again and again as enemies of freedom. Some of the world's most powerful jurists and politicians applauded this decision, just as they would approve of definitions of waterboarding as something other than torture. But others denounced it as bizarre and altogether illegitimate. Among the latter were soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan. Members of the invading forces, some of them quietly suggested to their commanding officers that taking detainees to Guantanamo Bay would only provoke the enemy to treat them more unfairly. Some who survived, those who lost their lives in the nightmarish events of 9/11, have spoken out as well, at times in more vocal ways. For example, following her visit to the base, Julia Rodriguez, sister of Greg Rodriguez, who perished in the World Trade Center, described the legal hearings there as an unlawful and immoral experiment. In her words, there has never been a trial like this in American history, one in which defendants accused of civilian crimes are tried in a military court, in an offshore prison, and in a system that does not uphold human rights standards for a fair trial. Nevertheless, some reports cultivate the idea that there is an old Guantanamo and a new Guantanamo. I hear people saying this sort of thing often. In the new Guantanamo, transparency is valued, and the mistakes of the past, if they are said to have happened at all, do not need to be discussed in detail. We've learned from the past, and we've cleaned up our act. That's the idea. Unfortunately, no new Guantanamo exists. The prison's public affairs unit may have become better at managing visiting journalists and what they write about, but it is a place of ongoing abuse, one in which abuse is devastating and deeply institutionalized. As noted by Mansour Adafi, a former prisoner who has testified in the EU and contributed to several awareness-raising campaigns, just last month, numerous Gitmo prisoners went on a hunger strike to protest their mistreatment. It's difficult, though, to know details because the Joint Task Force 160, this is the group that's in control of detention, no longer issues reports on the number of prisoners on hunger strikes. This is one of the many things that you simply can't get data on. Or if you're visiting as a reporter, you agree not to ask about this sort of thing in a signed document prior to your arrival. In addition, the topics that can be discussed in media visits, including press conferences, is severely restricted. Nevertheless, it seems that practices that have been classified as torture by human rights organizations and related international agreements are ongoing. So what I'm saying is in this new Guantanamo, in the current situation, torture continues to happen. Torture is defined in broad ways and includes actions such as the following: forced feeding twice a day for hunger strikers. Most hunger strikers see that as a peaceful form of protest. Solitary confinement. Solitary confinement sometimes has gone on for years. A large number of years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years. Imprisonment for decades without being told why you are there and without being charged of any crime. Ongoing detention even after you've been cleared for release. Some legal scholars also classify this as a type of torture. US government leaders and large numbers of ordinary people still associate the prisoners with the images instilled by former US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld's 2002 statement, when he said that these men are among the most dangerous, best trained, vicious killers on the face of the earth. The Bush administration's description of the prisoners as evil and a monolithic block, the worst of the worst, reinforced these negative images as well as Islamophobia. Such accusations have continued for years, even after the United States military authorities recognized that the overwhelming majority of the men it had imprisoned there have no connection to terrorism. A bit about the legacy of violence that Guantanamo is part of. The US naval base at Guantanamo Bay is controversial because of its links to various forms of violence. But information detailing this violence and its history is often vague, and even general accounts of past violations of basic rights are subjected to aggressive forms of erasure. With this in mind, I point out that the naval base is the site from which the US has engaged in numerous military actions, as well as the platform from which it invaded and occupied several Caribbean and Central American countries. At times, US troops toppled progressive governments elected by the people in operations that left from Guantanamo Bay. This list of military actions can be read as a litany suggesting how violence redirected the futures of entire societies. It shows that this single site has played a significant role in the geopolitical transformation of the Americas. Puerto Rico was invaded from Guantanamo Bay in 1898. Military actions took place from Guantanamo Bay into Cuba in 1898, and from the period between 1906 and 1909, and again in 1912. Mexico, part of Mexico was occupied from Guantanamo Bay in 1913. Haiti was occupied from 1914 to 1934 by the United States, and that operation was organized at Guantanamo Bay. The Dominican Republic was also occupied by the United States, with operations organized from Guantanamo Bay. The occupation lasted from 1916 to 1924. Nicaragua from 1926 to 1933. Guatemala, actions in Guatemala took place in 1960. What does time mean when the same thing happens over and over? Is this a way of forcibly defining what people should value or how they should be? Guantanamo Bay as a militarized space is itself a contradiction, a ritual performed to create a concept of the enemy and what is good and what is necessary. But it is also a gray area and a place in which the concept of sovereignty is troubled at every turn, and therefore must be performed and reperformed daily in the most emphatic possible terms, and yet invisible. The point of this ritual is to sustain. The point of this ritual is to not let us get too far ahead of ourselves. The point of this ritual is to reinforce common values that we share and to define us, at times in terms of some of our worst tendencies, most notably dehumanization. The invisible yet glaring performance of violence has repeatedly consumed the heart of Guantanamo, a concept fraught by modernity's tragically limited view of what should come next. The cycles of violence that have closed in on this place are always contested, and resistance to them operates in dialogue with broader forces, ensuring that hope is maintained in both what is sustained as ritual and in our visions of a future that is more sustainable as well as just. A few comments about Haitian detention. Guantanamo Bay is also the site of a sequence of controversial experiments in migrant detention and interpretations of asylum. For example, in the 1990s, roughly 45,000 Cubans and Haitians who were seeking sanctuary were detained in camps there for years. While both groups were held under unacceptable conditions, the situation that the Haitians faced was especially horrific. Reports document numerous problems. Many were denied access to lawyers and adequate medical care. Some were beaten and put in solitary confinement. Others were forcibly repatriated to Haiti, where they were persecuted or even faced death. And those who were HIV positive were imprisoned behind barbed wire, in spaces that their advocates, as well as some government bureaucrats who spoke out against them, described as concentration camps. Less well known is that since 1991, the base has also been home to a secretive migrant operations center that has held asylum seekers and other migrants. Operated by a private corporation, people detained there include individuals who fled persecution, many with the hope of finding sanctuary in the United States. However, because authorities wish to discourage the entry of poor people who travel by boat, even those legally recognized as refugees within this migration center are systematically denied entry to the United States. Even less well known is that one of the models informing the development of policies and practices of detention for the Haitians in the 1990s and the Muslim detainees in the wake of 9/11 is Fort Allen, a detention facility in Puerto Rico where 794 Haitian refugees and asylum seekers were held in 1981 and 1982. In recent years, the US Navy has spent millions of dollars on the development of infrastructure at Gitmo that can be used to set up crude tent cities very quickly. These would be cities like those that existed there in the 1990s. According to journalist Carol Rosenberg, this infrastructure has been planned to facilitate the housing of migrants in particular those who flee Cuba or Haiti for U.S. shores, in the case of a large-scale migration event. Preparations have also been made for the apprehension of migrants in the context of military intervention in Haiti in the months ahead. That has happened just in the past 3 or 4 weeks. Crucially, the violence of the aforementioned events is not limited to the past. Instead, it's ongoing. It extends into the realities of today. Speaking about Guantanamo Bay in 2003, the historian Amy Kaplan called Guantanamo a story of the future, and went on to state, "We face the danger today that this floating colony will become the norm rather than an anomaly, that homeland security will increasingly depend on proliferating these mobile, ambiguous spaces between the domestic and the foreign." But some of what she predicted has already taken shape. Detention centers, laws, and regulations associated with controversial asylum and immigration laws and policies in other regions of the world have been modeled after those at the U.S. Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay. In addition, influential politicians in the US, Australia, and Europe alike have recently called for the future construction of Guantanamo-inspired facilities. This has happened in the Mediterranean, Eastern Europe, and North Africa as well. While anti-migrant sentiments in these and other contexts can be fairly common or even rampant, it's not always clear whether proponents of such initiatives are aware of the disastrous consequences of the laws, policies, and practices that they seek to emulate. In addition to suggesting that history doesn't matter, much of the mainstream media shapes the future by propagating myths about the base, its past, and the men imprisoned there. This is clear in sensationalistic coverage and the ongoing use of terms such as enemy combatant and terrorist to describe men that the US government indicates are not that. The imperialist strategies forged across this sequence of military invasions and occupations inform the tactics and operations of the US military today, as well as widely held ideas about the Caribbean and its relationship to US national security. Gitmo, as a US military prison and base of operations in the global war on terror, is deeply implicated in the redefinition of human rights, freedom of expression, international laws and treaties, and understandings of universal democracy. It has continually shaped the relations of force and power outside the base, striving to reconfigure commonsensical notions of freedom that rely on the propagation of fear and intolerance. This is a legacy of the state's conceptualization of freedom in terms of restrictions dating back to the early history of the Caribbean during the colonial period. This history includes early experiments in colonization and plantation slavery, struggles for emancipation and national liberation, and perilous devotion to commercial and military expansion. It is also visible in the military base at Guantanamo. It's in its use as an important strategic discursive site in a network of between 800 and 1,000 overseas US military bases. This network is distributed across more than 130 countries. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Walicek. So our next speaker is a former prisoner from Guantanamo, and we have a pre-recorded video, but we would like to read his bio. So Mahamadou O. Salahi is a writer, human rights activist, and former Guantanamo Bay prisoner. Originally from Mauritania and trained as an engineer, he was detained at the U.S. government's Guantanamo Bay naval base without charge for 14 years. Salahi wrote a memoir during his incarceration, an international bestseller and the first memoir to be published during the author's detention at Guantanamo Bay. It was published with hundreds of redactions in January 2015 as Guantanamo Diary. A restored edition was published in 2017 following his release. The memoir was used as the basis for The Mauritanian, a 2021 film. His friendship with Steve Wood, his former guard, is chronicled in the documentary My Brother's Keeper. In 2021, his novel, The Actual True Story of Ahmed and Zarga, was published by Ohio University Press in its Modern African Writers series. He is currently writer-in-residence at Noord-Netherlands Toneel, a Dutch theater company. So if we would welcome Mahamadou.
Hi everyone. 20 years ago, unintentionally, I became a student of freedom and forgiveness. Over the past 2 decades, much of that time spent in an isolation hut in the United States detention camp at Guantanamo Bay. I had a series of epiphanies that taught me what it means to be free, forgiving, and showed me how to get there. The first epiphany came the moment I realized that the team who were cutting my clothes off with scissors, putting me in a diaper and jumpsuit, and blindfolding me was from the United States of America. That I was about to disappear into an American prison. Scenes from a documentary I'd watched in Germany about American prison danced through my mind. The American justice system, with its harsh 100-year sentences, the violence of prisons, the violence of 9/11, and in the middle of it now, me, Arab, a person of color, African, Muslim, speaking almost no English. I could see it. I was going to die in prison, or worse, I was going to be executed. I'd be held in shackles in front of cameras as a mass murderer in a diaper and sweatpants. And this would be the last image my family will have of me. How sad would be this to my mother. Of course, I prayed for 2 things. One, I prayed not to dishonor my family in front of the world. And 2, I prayed to have a child before I died. But no sooner did I utter the prayer than the realization returned. I was going to die in prison. The way I was in that moment was the last image my family will ever have of me, and I would never have a child. And that's when I really started to see behind the blindfold my entire life suddenly played before me like a tape. The way they say it does for those facing sudden, unexpected death. It played smoothly for the most part, and I swallowed it smoothly. But there were parts I choked on. The parts I choked on were my regrets. And what did I regret? I didn't regret the things that I pursued with the most energy, time, and effort. I didn't regret not making a good money. I didn't regret not having that beautiful man I so much wanted in my life. Even dying, I didn't seem to regret. I somehow made peace with the prospect that my life soon would end. No, I realized as clear as day that the only thing I regretted was not being nice enough to the people I love and the people I met in general. I regretted not being kind enough. I regretted the times I criticized my mother's or my ex's cooking. I regretted getting angry and speaking to others in anger. I remember one after my time I had failed to do the simple thing of being kind. I wished only that I had been nicer and more forgiving. That was it. This moment of preparing me for the rendition flight took only 5 minutes. But that 5 minutes changed the way I looked at life forever. Having a good life, I understood, is simple. Pursuing money and status takes so much work, but being nice, being kind is simple, and it's what will matter most when I say goodbye to this life. There is another epiphany that came during the words of my interrogation. For days, I had barely slept. No sooner was I returned to my cell and I fell into my bed, then the cell door opened and I was shackled again and led back to more interrogation. Every time I passed the surface that reflected my image back to me, I ducked. That's how much I hated myself. I was brought into the interrogation room and shackled to the floor. I tried to imagine the psychological state of the soldiers who were locking me in place, but in fact, they didn't seem to have a psychological state. It was me who was losing my mind from fear. As the guards were securing me, quote unquote, they didn't even interrupt their conversation, bantering back and forth as if I wasn't there, and reciting lines from the latest movies and songs. The same was true for the interrogators waiting in the room. They barely paused their conversation when we entered, despite clear rules against talking about their personal lives in front of us, detainees. I was non-existent to them, as I was being bolted to the floor. They were having fun, their conversation veering from happy things to small daily frustrations and back to happy things. Suddenly, as if my mind had become the cameras up in the corner of the room, I saw them and I saw me. There we were, one detainee, 2 interrogators, and 2 guards, all the same species, in the same room, same temperature, same conditions, but we were in totally different psychological universes. I saw that the difference between me and my guards and interrogators was that I kept terrorizing myself with catastrophic scenarios of what was coming, and they were thinking about other things. We have an old saying where I am from: he who is afraid of the demon will meet them. But if we ought to be afraid of anything, it's the way we think. I realized that day in the interrogation room that we have before us at any moment 2 books. One of the books is the book of freedom, happiness, and forgiveness. And the other book is the book of bondage and desperation, the book of hate, the book of resentment. And as hard as it is to recognize sometimes we have the freedom to choose which book to open and curate. The more I curate the good book, the freer and happier I become. And there was yet another epiphany that came few years later when the worst of my interrogation was over. I was sitting in my isolation cell one night watching TV. I couldn't sleep. A common state for prisoners. And so I was flipping through channels. This particular night I settled on an Afghani channels. I didn't speak Dari or Farsi, but neither did I speak Polish or Portuguese or Romanian. I had spent other nights watching Polish and Portuguese and Romanian stations. Whichever stations that evening had the happiest faces. I would cry when they cried the most. I would smile when they smiled. I would laugh when they laughed. And yet, I didn't understand anything. There was a special connection between us human beings that did not need any linguistic skills to establish the communication. A smiling face always brings smile to my face. Unhappy face, someone in pain always brings out my compassion and even my sadness. Happiness is a language in its own right, and I studied that language every night. I remember this Afghani young man. He was probably between 18 and 20. And we were neighbors, cell neighbors. We didn't speak the other language, but we still communicated. We laughed. We told ourselves, we tell each other stories. I told him stories of my life. He told me stories of my life. He told me what he did. He was fee collector. He would hang in the back of the bus, and when the passengers get out, they pay him. And I understood all of that, and we did not speak each other's language. He understood that I was sad that I couldn't see my family. I understood that he was sad because he couldn't see his family. And going back to this channel, I was watching that night. The program that night was not comedy or game show or big love story. There was one speaker, a small, dark-skinned, athletic-looking man. He was addressing a crowd in an auditorium, and the picture was not very clear. The quality was not very good. But it was clear that he was some kind of motivational speaker. He was talking about happiness or something like that. He had an open, honest face, smiling face, and even in his language, his explanation for his happiness was easy to follow. He was describing his habit of ending each day by writing 5 items on his gratitude list. He told the audience the items he puts on this list do not have to be very significant. For instance, he said, just being there and giving his speech was going to be on that day's list. Life has many teachers, and the best of them say pretty much the same thing. I love this quote from the Quran. If you would count up the favors of God, never would you be able to number them, for God is oft forgiving, most merciful. Quran 16:18. That night, sitting in my cell, watching this motivational speaker, I tried to list things about my life in an isolation cell that I could thank God for. I had trouble at first. I kept seeing myself inside of my situation like a dot at the center of Guantanamo on Google Maps. But when I looked closer home at what I could actually see, I found a treasure chest right there in my cell. Those TV channels from around the world that I was allowed to watch in my last couple of years, library books that I had access to, new ones delivered every Monday, my daily workout that I perform to maintain my health, the American medical care I had access to when I got sick, the opportunities I had every day to be nice and to show kindness to my guards. And so I continued day after day. I would list things I was grateful for. I ate a good meal. I haven't wronged anyone. I watched a good movie. I learned how to code from books my interrogator gave me. I comforted the guard who lost his cousins. After so many years of waiting for someone else to give me freedom and to teach me forgiveness, just making this list would make my heart start to feel like I was flying and my body like it could breathe again. My blessing was beyond counting, just as the verse 16-18 teaches. Every atom of my body started to feel better and free. Thank you very much.
Amazing to see a man that suffered so much have the ability to show so much love and peace. At this point, I asked a friend and colleague to do a theological reflection from a Christian perspective and pastoral reflection upon everything that we've been hearing. And I want to present to you Reverend Dr. Juan A. Carmona, who is an ordained minister in the Reformed Church in America. He was born and raised in New York City by his Puerto Rican family. He received his Bachelor's of Arts in Comparative Religions from the State University of New York, a Master's of Divinity from New Brunswick Theological Seminary, and a Doctor of Ministry degree in Liberation Theology from the Colgate Rochester Grocer Divinity School. He is a retired prison chaplain with the New York State Department of Correctional Services and has taught at various institutions of higher education, including having served as visiting scholar at the Taiwan Theological College and Seminary in Taiwan. Dr. Carmona is the author of 2 books, The Puerto Rican Diaspora, A Model Theology, and The Sovereignty of Taiwan, A Theological Perspective. He is married to Ruth Ayala Carmona and has 3 children, Dr. Godfrey Antonio Carmona, who is the president of the University of St. Martin, and Jessica Carmona and Araida and Jessica Carmona Baez. Without further ado, Dr. Carmona, please come forward.
Dr. Cruz, thank you for inviting me to be the respondent to Dr. Walicek. And Dr. Walicek, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your cogent and clear presentation. And it is my privilege to respond to your presentation as both a pastor and as a theologian in the following manner. And I also address all of my sisters and brothers who are here tonight to listen to this presentation. I begin by responding, first of all, from a pastoral perspective. And I will talk about my pastoral work in what has become known in the United States as one of the fastest, if not the fastest, growing industries in the United States. The jail prison system, the penal system, the system of incarceration. The majority of my pastoral work was as a prison chaplain within the New York State Department of Correctional Services for 21 years. And having witnessed the abuse and mistreatment of detainees, some called them the inmates, others called them the prisoners, and others called them the residents. I always refer to our sisters and brothers in the penal system as the residents. The abuse, and there's a clear corollary between what I experienced in the prison system as a chaplain and what Dr. Walicek presented in his presentation regarding the detainees at Gitmo. And as a person who worked in that system, I was called as a pastor to bring to them the element of human dignity. And people raise the question, what is the big deal about the element of human dignity? In the environment, and I will not be at all surprised if the same thing happens at Gitmo with the detainees, in this environment of dehumanization and cruelty, there was a particular term that was used with the residents. They were referred to as a piece of shit. They were dehumanized. They were treated badly. And I remember the superintendent of one prison that I worked at in Staten Island, New York. The employees were constantly complaining about the inmates. They continued to say, these damned inmates, these damned inmates. And one day the superintendent, or as we know them, the warden, got sick and tired of hearing the employees bellyaching about these damned inmates. And he got so angry and said to them, let me tell you something. If it weren't for these damned inmates, half of you will be working at McDonald's. The next day, half of the staff came wearing McDonald's hats to protest the statement of the superintendent. And in that environment, it was my role as a pastor to affirm their dignity and human worth as a countercurrent to the tendency to treat them as less than human. It was truly a challenge to go against the institutional current of dehumanization. Nevertheless, the promotion of religion and spirituality generated a redeeming grace, which enabled many of the residents to overcome the feeling of worthlessness and gave them hope for a constructive future beyond the gates. Secondly, Dr. Walicek, I respond from a theological standpoint, and as I mentioned to you a few weeks ago in our brief conversation, I am a theologian in the tradition of liberation theology, and more specifically, Latin American and Hispanic diasporic liberation theology. Liberation theology emphasizes that oppression and suffering are the starting points for biblical interpretation and theological reflection. Whether it be the scriptures of the Bible, the Torah, or the Holy Quran, oppression and suffering are the starting points for scriptural interpretation and theological reflection. Oppression and suffering constitute what the late Dr. James Cone, who was a professor here at Union Theological Seminary for approximately 40 years, what he referred to as the central semantic axis of theology. And in Dr. Cone's view, with which I totally resonate, God talk, which is in more common modern parlance, is the word that is used for theology. Theology is totally irrelevant and totally useless if it does not address oppression and suffering in the world. And in that case, it would be what some would call mental gymnastics and what Dr. Cone would call intellectual masturbation. What does any of this have to do with Gitmo? Why are you talking about the prison system? And you're supposed to be talking about Gitmo. That's what Dr. Walicek spoke about. I respond to that question by first of all raising the age-old question that was raised back some centuries ago. What does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? In other words, what does theology have to do with philosophy? That's not my question tonight. My question tonight is, what does Jerusalem have to do with Gitmo? What is the relevance of theology to a situation of detention in a place which was constructed as a result of USA colonialism and imperialism? And I thank you from the bottom of my heart, Dr. Walicek, for putting this whole idea, this whole notion of Gitmo in the context of the colonial and imperialistic relationship, not only between the United States and Cuba, but between the United States and the rest of Latin America, and the imperial and colonial relationship between what I call Slave Town USA and other countries of the so-called Third World. What does theology have to do with Gitmo? I also respond by saying that colonialism and imperialism, accompanied by the violation of human rights, makes it difficult to do as one of the Psalm writers raised in the 137th Psalm, when the exiles were taunted by their captors and were asked to sing a song from the old country. They were bothered. Sing is one of those oldies but goodies. And they responded, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And I'm sure that that's exactly the question that our sisters and brothers in Gitmo are asking. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? For those of us who have a Puerto Rican background, we're familiar with the song En Mi Viejo San Juan, the desire to remember our beloved island of Puerto Rico. The Hebrew exiles in Babylon dealt with this question in an environment of contempt and hostility. Indeed, the detainee population at Gitmo has suffered the same atrocity that confined people everywhere suffer. The mere fact that they have had to undergo waterboarding, as Dr. Walicek pointed out, and other methods that are used to elicit false confessions, in and of itself points to dehumanization. the element of a fair and speedy trial is missing. And he pointed this out in his presentation very clearly. The arrest and detainment of these human beings on the basis of their having been complicit, allegedly speaking, in the tragic events of 9/11/01 is reminiscent of how prisoners here are arrested on the basis of ethnicity, race, and suspicion of complicity with terrorism. In closing, I wish to say a heartfelt thank you to you, my dear brother, for bringing to our attention and for consciousness raising regarding the mistreatment of human beings by the so-called greatest nation on earth, Slavetown, USA, regarding their mistreatment, which for many years, the Slavetown, USA, just like Egypt, was considered the land of abundance, and now for many has become the house of bondage. As an aside and corollary, I say, que viva Cuba libre, que viva Palestina libre, yours in the struggle. Thank you.
Naya set this up to have a conversation here. I feel like I'm at Sally Jesse Raphael's show. For the young people who don't remember her, Oprah Winfrey. I want to give an opportunity for some questions from the audience and a little bit of conversation. But I want to start off with a question to Don. And you could chime in too. As you spoke, and in my wanting to do this evening, what I was thinking a lot about was how we've forgotten those people in Guantanamo. I see the gentleman that did that video, and I say, how could we forget? And I was reading the other days that there's a place similar to Gitmo in Lithuania, I think. The United States apparently has several places like Guantanamo where they're torturing people. So you got into this research. What called your attention to do this type of work? You have, if you want to use the mic.
I was teaching, thank you for the question. I was teaching at the University of Puerto Rico, where I continue to teach, but I was teaching first-year students, which I no longer do. One of my favorite groups were the first-year students. And I decided I wanted to assign something that was really connected to the contemporary world, right? And something, you know, something that would catch their attention. And so I had been thinking about Guantanamo because I'm interested in the Caribbean, and I was also sort of fascinated but perplexed by why people did not think of it as a Caribbean site. It's in Cuba, right? And so I wanted to do both of those things. I wanted to think about it as a Caribbean site and give the students, you know, an assignment that was really meaningful. And so the first thing I did is I assigned Mohamedou Ould Slahi's Guantanamo Diary, right? The first version of it. And actually, I hadn't even read it yet. I just read a couple of pages and I said, I think it's gonna work. And that was the redacted version. So when his editor and lawyers finally went through the very long process of having that manuscript approved, the US government redacted it. I believe there are about 2,000 and something words, you know, that had black bars over them. And so the students read that, We did an exercise where they imagined what was behind the black boxes and things like that. And it was just a really useful exercise. And so starting from there, that's how things got launched.
It really called my attention when you started speaking about Guantanamo Bay, that geographical area, as a site. I don't know if you framed it this way, but as a site where a lot of evil has come out of. It's almost scary. And I said, there's a site that's even bigger than that, which is the United States of America. Unfortunately, a lot of evil is perpetuated throughout the world that comes out of here. But it seems like we have an internal politics and an external politics. We all benefit from the internal politics while we exploit and destroy other places. And we are probably one of the biggest abusers of human rights, but we're supposed to be that shining city up in the mountain. Carmona, would you like to respond to any of this?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. I forgot to say that Carmona is probably our main Puerto Rican public theologian in the United States, and we're happy to have him here. Look him up and look up his faith book. He always has something interesting to say about almost every topic. I'm serious. It's good stuff.
Thank you. Okay, just briefly, because I really want to hear from our sisters and brothers in the audience, but just following, as a parallel with Dr. Walicek, my doctoral dissertation at the Colgate Rochester Divinity School in 1982 was on the colonial status of Puerto Rico. It was entitled The Liberation of Puerto Rico, A Theological Perspective. And then some years later, my son, Dr. Jeffrey Antonio Carmona, who Dr. Walicek and Dr. Cruz know, did his work on Cuba at the University of Amsterdam. He did his master's and PhD work on Cuba, and he wrote another book on Cuba. He spent some time there, and he did make some allusion to Gitmo. So when Dr. Cruz invited me to respond to Dr. Walicek, I said, wow, this is like a revival, okay? I wrote on Puerto Rico, my son wrote on Cuba, and he's invited Dr. Walicek to speak on Cuba, so it's like, we're coming full circle, all right? And so I think that there's like a real corollary between Dr. Walicek's work and my own and, that of my son. But I don't know if you want to turn it over to the audience, Dr. Cruz, or, I want to hear from my sisters and brothers here to see if there's any particular input or response.
Yeah, that's what we were going to do. If you have questions or comments, we welcome them at this point.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for your speech, for your talk. It was really incredible. I just even started listening to season 4 of Serial on Guantanamo, so it was just so cool to have it be so relevant in my mind. My question is about Gitmo as a success story. In my head, I really can't understand in what universe it would be seen as a success and or replicated. We do know that prisons are just a reincarnation of slavery and that there's an economic model attached to why it's growing. And so I guess I'm wondering if you can explain more on why it's seen as a success, given that so many of the there was so many lawsuits against them since so many of the guards had psychotic breaks and since they didn't really get any information, one, and then two, what then is the economic incentive for keeping it running?
Great questions. I also see a close connection between the history of slavery and the history of incarceration and some of the, I call them technologies, right? Specific practices or tools that are used inside this prison and probably others. And these are so daunting and they're devastating. Sometimes I can flip through the material and process it all, but then all of a sudden, one of them will just hit me, and then I don't want to do anything the rest of the day. And one of the most disturbing things is the continuity across time, right? Of very specific, sometimes material things. Even the shackles that were used in Cuba, for example, the same company made shackles. I'm talking about in Cuba during the slave trade, right? Hyatt and Company, an English company, made shackles in the 1800s and made shackles that some of the detainees wore when they were doing things like watching these international television programs, right? Alone in a small room, shackled to the floor. And so you asked how that could become a success story, right? I might be shifting like your wording a little bit. I think it has to do with a lot of fear and leaving out the human element, never mentioning these people's names, never mentioning their stories, never mentioning, when we hear, Guantanamo is in the news fairly, regularly, a story or two, but there's rarely a framing or contextualization when someone, the journalist, looks back and situates everything, reminds you, the reader, of how things have changed, over time. Usually instead it's a quick, superficial glance of something really specific, right? And so when I started reading about Guantanamo and I visited the prison and I went to Guantanamo City and talking to people, I had all these questions, but I really didn't know where to start. And then over time, my understanding of everything changed, substantially. And so I think, there's so much anti-migrant sentiment, and in Europe and in the U.S. as well, and all of this leads us to look at the history of this place very superficially. There are overt actions that have taken place to dehumanize these men, and to prevent the public at large from having any empathy. For example, poetry was published in 2007 in a book that I briefly mentioned, Poems from Guantanamo. That book was banned in many places. It generated a lot of controversy. The US government tried to prohibit it from being published. All of the poems in that volume had been approved for release. All of them had been translated. But there was something really powerful about putting them together, right, in a volume that sort of broke a really important rule, right? Similarly, there was an exhibit here a few years ago, about 6 or 7 years ago in John Jay College, where art was exhibited, art that had been approved for release. I saw it briefly, but shortly after I saw it, it was also shut down, right? Not by the institution, but by representatives of the federal government, right? So I think those actions do affect how the public at large makes sense of this place, right? I don't know if that, kind of is. Do you feel like I've answered your question? Yeah?
So why was it, I get the dehumanization, I get it definitely worked in otherizing people and Islamophobia, but then why would another country like Australia want to have it, is it also just to otherize and dehumanize and proliferate Islamophobia?
They want to keep, some political parties, very powerful ones, want to keep migrants out, right? And then they rally around that, and it becomes a big thing, and it becomes a major debate in society to the extent that it was not before, right? It happens in the US as well. And so they start changing laws that used to facilitate, the provision of hearings and applications to asylum. I believe Australia even officially deterritorialized some of the small keys in the northern part of the country where refugees used to land temporarily. And if you landed on those keys, you had rights, sort of like coming in, you know, the United States. If you cross the border, you have a right to certain things you don't have a right to when you're on the other side. So to prevent those rights from being available, they said these small pieces of land are no longer officially Australia, right? So that just underscores, you know, the extent to which the politicians will go, right? I think that's key, right?
Thank you so much. That
Sure.
unfortunately makes sense.
Thank you so much, both of you. And this question is for Reverend Carmona, but all could take it. I'm wondering about the kind of going into the system work of prison chaplaincy, and how going into a space like that is to somehow tacitly endorse the system, versus a kind of abolitionist perspective where you just choose to stay out of it completely.
No, it's an excellent. Can you hear me? It's an excellent question, brother. I struggled with that question the 21 years that I served as a chaplain with the New York State Department of Correctional Services. And sometimes people would ask me or ask other chaplains, are you in this job because it pays well or because God has called you to this? And some of us would respond both and. Okay, it's not either or. It reminds me of the prophet Isaiah being on the king's payroll, being a statesperson in the king's court, and to a certain extent Moses. Okay, so in a sense, being employed by the oppressor, because definitely the prison system, the incarceration system, okay, is a tool of the oppressing systems, okay, to keep people down. And to put it in a more global sense, okay, we're talking about white supremacy. We can't deny it. You know, I think that white supremacy is really at the heart of everything that we're talking about here. So it's a question of, and you know, this thing about the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party, that's a crock of bull dung. Both parties, okay, are entrenched in maintaining a white supremacist-based nation state. And the prison system, the fastest growing industry in the United States, okay, is one of the major tools of this imperialist system. So for those of us who want to bring in the God element, okay, and do God talk within that system, it presents a conundrum for many of us, because, you know, are we doing it to respond to the call of God to bring good news to the poor, to the oppressed, and to the incarcerated, or are we doing it because it brings in good revenues? Okay, I don't know if that answers your question, brother.
It does. I'm just imagining what a chaplain would look like in Guantanamo.
Yeah,
You know,
well,
to even like enter into that space to
Yeah.
bring a good news is to kind of like endorse and somehow the existence of it.
Yes.
There's a book called, I believe it's called For God and Country by James Yee. He was the second Muslim chaplain there in the it was still the early years of the operation of the prison. I don't know if you've heard of him. So he's a West Point graduate. He believed, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but my perception is that he really believed in the U.S. military, and he wanted to be a good chaplain to these men, and he was very aware of what his responsibilities were, which existed on a list, very tangible, and he followed them, and he had a lot of problems. So he ended up being detained himself, which he describes in detail. And I don't remember the proper terms, right? But kicked out of the military basically, and his life was, you know, his professional life was destroyed, right?
Yeah. I was written up at the Cape Vincent Correctional Facility for publicly denouncing Desert Storm. I sent out a memo prison-wide, and I got called on the carpet, and I was disciplined. Okay, not punished, but, you know, basically reprimanded. And And that, I think, starts to address a little bit of your question there. Okay, can we stand in protest against the system that, can we bite the hand that's feeding us in that respect, which I think is part of your question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Did you have a question, Tanya?
The blockade, the blockade of Cuba and how it might impact the Guantanamo possession. I was curious about the blockade, the Cuban blockade, and how the impact, it has on the relationship to Guantanamo.
Good question. Let's see. You're talking about the U.S. blockade, the embargo, right? And the relationship between that and Guantanamo. I find it hard to answer coherently, but I'm going to shift it a little bit, okay? If that's okay, which might also be insightful. The existence of Guantanamo as a U.S. occupied space is very important to the Cuban government. When Obama visited however many years ago, I don't know how long it's been, like roughly what, 2012, thank you. It was on the list of things that had to be worked out to normalize relations, right? That's when he went to Havana. And there weren't that many things on the list. Maybe there were 10 things or 12 things, if I remember correctly. And so some political scientists and people who study international relations believe that one reason the United States, one of the reasons the base is maintained is to have a bargaining chip for the future with the Cuban government. And to say, if you do X and Y, usually the language that's used is regime change, which would, we'll give you Guantanamo back, right? And so that would also come with the elimination of the embargo, right? This normalization of relations, right? That's the first thing that comes to mind.
It seemed like Obama was going in that direction, but Biden doesn't seem to follow suit.
Yeah, seems like Biden has perpetuated, some of the policies that also existed under the Trump administration.
We'll take one more question. And let me just mention quickly that the United States pays Cuba $3,000 a month rent. The Cubans have never cashed a check. But they determined their own rental agreements and they just took over the place. It's almost like an abusive thing, like to show we have power and we're going to ridicule you by giving you $3,000 a month. Yes,
okay.
Reverend Keating.
Just I would like to congratulate both of you. You did a good presentation, especially when you spoke about GMO, and I saw GMO in a different context in relation to be a place of oppression, going back and establishing the imperialism in Guatemala. You mentioned Haiti, you mentioned Dominican Republic, you mentioned certain days that made me think more about Guantanamo. And also, Dr. Carmona, he did a great response to you in the way that he was a chaplain for 21 years. I was a community chaplain for 21 years too. I was working at the state office, 163. Is and 120 feet Adam Clayton Power on the 18th floor. I worked 21 years as a chaplain. Chaplain is like a mix of the counselor in one way and a social worker on the other way. And working, we see the kind of language that many times had to be used with the image. I like the way that you presented that the prisoner those are incarcerated, those are resident, and when you came to the resident in the different way that those presentations are made. But one important thing is to see that in the United States, I am American. Many times when I used to go to the immigration, I'm Puerto Rican, no? I've been here 54 years. And when I go to immigration, sometimes they told me, sir, because I had my accent, sir, from where you are coming? I say, I'm American. I don't want to say I'm Puerto Rican. I am American. I'm Puerto Rican, but I say, I am American. And they said, you're American? You know. So one of the things that we can see, when you finish your response, I like something when you say, Viva Cuba, Viva Palestina. Many of us are seeing what is happening in Palestine or Palestina right now. I've been 35 times in Israel. When I work with the Palestinian agency to bring groups, I stay in Hebron, Nablus, I take my group to take in Bethlehem. I have many Palestinian friends. I go, I eat with them. 2 million Palestinian are Israeli. You go to Nazareth, they are Israeli, 2 million there, but they are oppressed. But the thing that happened that from our context of the USA, especially in religion, I'm Pentecostal, and in my tradition, they will say everything is okay because that's prophecy. My tradition, they see the Israel now as the Israel in the Old Testament, and they don't know the difference between a Zionist and Judaism. They don't see that. They see prophecy. Last night, I had an interview with many ministers from Puerto Rico, Carolina, and they called me and they told me, because I wrote 2 books dealing with the eschatology about the Revelation and also the book of Daniel. And I saw that kind of context. Guantanamo is like a window in the way that you presented that make us to think more of what is happening. Because we talk about social justice, I believe I am a prophetic voice. I am a prophetic voice. I am an ordained minister going back to 1970. I've been as a clergy 50 years. I'm 74 now. So I've been a clergy for 50 years, ordained. So what happened that we want to be an example to the world, but we have something like that window, the dark window of Gimo or Guantanamo. So I believe that tonight it has been a successful night because we can see the 2 points. From the historical point, geography, the context, and also from the theological and pastoral point of view, and I want to congratulate both of you. Thank you for your presentation. Your presentation has reached our hearts, our mind, and God keep us. Samuel, bendiciones para ti. Sigue hacia adelante siempre, que papá Dios te bendiga. Gracias, mi gente.
Thank you all for being here, and let's give the 2